We welcome you once again to the ancient paths.
Yes.
Now, the journey through Genesis has been beautiful.
Yes.
We have learned consistently that there exists but only two cultures. The original culture with God at the head, and the alternative culture with Satan at the end. Now, all these cultures are contending, but God's culture is a little consistent,
Yes.
or extremely consistent, if we can say. On the other hand, the alternative culture comes in different forms. Now, in all these cultures, a baton is passed from one generation to another. A baton is a reminder of maybe a relay race.
Yeah.
But now this baton is in this manner. One generation passes it to the next so that they grow, they live, they support the principle that they subscribe to.
Amen.
It can be the alternative one, it can be the original one. And that brings us to today's episode.
Passing the baton. You know, we left it at a point where Abraham was tested by God. And as time passes by, we find that Sarah dies, you know. Probably in their mind, once they received the child of promise, they knew that all will be well. But somehow, Sarah dies, you know. That reminds us that also bad things happen to good people, but that shouldn't break our faith.
Wow, that is very true. Now, the second thing that we find is that after Sarai dies, Abraham marries Keturah,
Yes.
and they have other children. Now, after some time, Abraham also dies. It means that the call given to Abraham is threatened. It can end. So Abraham has to do things to ensure that he passes the baton to the next person.
Yes.
And the next in line we find Isaac, because he's the promised child.
Yes.
Even though Abraham had kids with Keturah, they were not the promised. The promise was not to come through them, it was to come through Isaac. Before his death, he sends away the children he had with Keturah. And the final assignment he does is to send Eliezer back to his homeland,
Yes.
to look for a wife for Isaac. Why would that be? You know, that is interesting. Because in the generation we live in, marriage is very personal to the youths. We hardly involve the elders because we believe their tastes are compromised in a given degree. But look, when you need to pass the baton to the next generation, and you know where you stand and where the Lord has walked with you, you'd be careful to consider this matter in marriage. Where they were, that was in Canaan.
Yes.
And the Canaanites, as we know them, in their culture, in their traditions, in their forms and practices, they subscribed to the alternative culture. Now, they had little or no love or respect or regard for God. It therefore needed an insight, a divine insight, to find a wife for the young man Isaac, because on his shoulder was the responsibility to carry the mantle to the next generation. Now they went back to the homeland. Eliezer was diligent in this task, and he got a beautiful lady called Rebecca.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So now we find that Isaac and Rebecca are married, but now they fall into the same dilemma, just like Abraham and Sarah. They had to wait 25 years to get the son of promise.
Wow.
Isaac and Rebecca had to wait less than 5 years of that. That's 20 years. But during that time, we find that the faith of Isaac was being developed, that they could totally depend and trust upon God. And that brings us to the verse of Genesis 25, verse 23. It says, "And the Lord said unto her, Two nations are in thy womb, and two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger," you know. And this happened as exactly God had told them. So here we learn that indeed God keeps his promise.
Amen. And you know, that also reminds us of what you said in the first place, that bad things can happen to good people.
Yeah.
And if you look keenly, all things work for the good of them who are called by his name.
Amen.
It means even in the time of when they were waiting for the promise of a child, their faith was being developed.
Yes.
Now back to this prophecy. God promises that that they will have children. But aside from that, he gives a prophetic insight that the older one will serve the younger one.
Mm-hmm.
It was God who made that promise. Therefore, it is just expedient to let God fulfill that promise in his manner. Because the defining terms of the older shall serve the younger were on God's realm. You know, when God says you will serve, it's different from the service that we may be thinking of most of the time.
Yes.
And we see Rebecca and Isaac giving birth to Jacob and Esau.
Yes.
Esau is the firstborn. Jacob is the secondborn. And because Rebecca had this pronouncement personally, she treasured it and was inclined to be more attached to the one who God made the promise towards, the one who would be the superior one. And when we look, we find Isaac is inclined towards Esau. Looking at their lives, you know, we find very interesting things. First, Esau is a hunter. Jacob is a tent guy. You know, he's a home person. We can call him a farmer. He's always at home. He's always around. A reminder of where we have come from. You know, if you remember when they mentioned hunter, it was Nimrod.
Yes.
When we remember person mentioned towards tents, it is Abraham. It can give us a clue. Probably Esau was inclined towards the alternative culture, and Jacob was inclined towards the original culture. But Jacob was not patient enough to wait for God to fulfill the promise he had made. He colluded with the mother, or the mother colluded with him to hasten the process of the fulfillment of this process. A mistake that we see in his father, his grandfather, and most of us make that same mistake. God makes the promise, but because he seems to tarry, or we don't have a clear insight or a direction on how he's going to fulfill it, so we come up with ways to help God fulfill the promises he makes. And in most times, if not all the times, we blow it up like Jacob did.
Yeah.
Now that brings us to another interesting point about the birthright issue.
Yes.
I don't know if you can tell us something about it.
Yes. So when you read the same chapter, verse 32, verse 31, and Jacob said, sell me this day thy birthright. And Esau said, behold, I am at the point to die. And what profit shall this birthright do to me?
Yes.
And Jacob said, swear to me this day. And he swore unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright.
Yes, you know, that brings me back to that prophecy. God knew, you know, when God gives a prophecy, he discerns the end from the beginning.
Yeah.
He can see the chances that these children are having, and Esau is inclined towards pleasure and self-gratification of himself, nothing else. Now, birthright in it carried not just inheritance of what the father had, but the spiritual mantle that was resting on the family. We come from a lineage where we have Abraham being called, then we have Isaac. Now the next person, when he takes on that birthright, it means he was going to be the spiritual leader. Esau is not really careful to handle that.
Yeah.
God promised to deliver this to Jacob, but Jacob used subtle tactics to attain that which God had promised.
Interesting.
We may be in the limelight of God's prophecies, but how often do we wait for God to bring to pass those which he had prophesied? Or do we hasten the prophecies by doing things or causing trouble or looking for shortcuts to help God facilitate the process?
Amen. So I'll read the last verse from 1 John chapter 3 verse 1. It says, behold what manner of love hath bestowed upon us. Behold what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God. Therefore the world knoweth us not, because it knew him not. Dear viewer, we have our birthright as the sons of God. Do we despise it? Amen.